I'm Rob Tracinski. This is Salon of the Refused, where we talk about ideas that are outside the mainstream. My guest today is Brad Thompson, who's a professor of political science at Clemson University, and also the author of this book, America's Revolutionary Mind, about the ideas behind the founding of America. But I'll let him talk about that. Thanks for coming on, Brad.
Hi, Rob. It's great to be with you and your audience. I appreciate coming on.
It's great to have you because I've really been enjoying this book. So I want to talk about the book first and talk about, so it's called America's Revolutionary Mind, and it's based on this idea of the American mind. So can you explain where that comes from?
Yeah, so the idea of the title comes from really the confluence of two famous quotations from the founding era, one by John Adams and the other by Thomas Jefferson. The one by John Adams, when he was trying to explain what the American Revolution was and what its causes were, he said that the American Revolution was not the war. He said the real revolution took place in the minds of the American people 15 years before a shot was ever fired at Lexington and Concord, which then means he's dating the beginning of the American Revolution to 1760, which is interesting in and of itself. And maybe we can talk about that later. The second quotation comes from Thomas Jefferson, who right at the very end of his life, in describing the Declaration of Independence, described it as, quote, an expression of the American mind. And so when I was thinking about these two quotations and what their meaning was relative to the American Revolution, it actually occurred to me that in many ways, despite the revolution being one of the most, if not the most written about subject in American history, that we actually know very little about the deepest causes, nature, and meaning of the revolution. Because if we can't explain what John Adams meant when he said that the revolution was in the minds of the people 15 years before Concord and Lexington, and then he went on to say that that revolution was a moral revolution in the minds of the American people. And as far as I could tell, no historians had really ever attempted to explain the revolution in those terms. So that was a key insight. And so what I did, Rob, with this book is I took these two quotations and the book really operates on two levels. So on one level, I'm beginning with the Thomas Jefferson quotation, talking about the Declaration as an expression of the American mind. So the book is a close textual analysis of the Declaration of Independence.
That's what I wanted to mention, is that's what I found fascinating about the way the book was written. It caught me a little by surprise. It basically takes that second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, et cetera, and takes that apart and takes that like word by word, phrase by phrase, saying, well, what did they mean by self-evident truth? What did they mean by men are created equal? So I thought that was fascinating, just taking it like word by word, phrase by phrase, and looking at the philosophical background of each of those.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So what I end up doing is using the Declaration of Independence as an ideological roadmap by which to understand the revolution as a whole. So as you say, I take basically every word, every phrase, every sentence of the Declaration, and I give it a fairly close textual analysis. And so you mentioned the second paragraph that begins famously with, we hold these truths to be self-evident. So I devote an entire chapter to just that phrase. What does it mean to say that we hold these truths to be self-evident? What does self-evident mean? What does truth mean? Who are the we in we hold these truths? What does it mean to hold a truth, right? And then that phrase is followed by 4 self-evident truths. And so then what I do is I devote 2 chapters to each of the 4 self-evident truths. And the 4 self-evident truths can be summed up in one word: equality, rights, consent, and revolution. So I take, let's just take rights, for instance, the second self-evident truth. So I devote 2 chapters to the concept of rights, and I then, and this is where then I go outside and beyond the Declaration of Independence, and I give a kind of intellectual history of the concept of rights from the late 17th century, beginning with John Locke, and then trace how Locke's understanding of rights was transported across the Atlantic in the early decades of the 18th century. And then I examined how American colonials then, how they attempted to understand and implement the concept of rights in colonial America. And then, most importantly, then examine how American patriots in the 1760s, in the light of the Stamp Act crisis, how they then revolutionized the traditional understanding of rights. And then I take it, of course, right up to 1776. And I do that with all 4 of the self-evident truths.
Now, I want to follow up on what you just said there, because there's some things you say in the book about how the concept of rights was looked at in England as more of a traditional and historical approach to rights, whereas in America, it became very much more distinctly a natural the idea that rights are come from nature and not from history and compacts and the Magna Carta.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in many ways, the intellectual and moral revolution that John Adams referenced in the famous quotation that I use as my starting point for the book is he's actually referring, I think, to that moment. And it really begins in 1765 with the Stamp Act. And so the Stamp Act, passed by the British Parliament, declares that the Americans have to pay what was actually, to be honest, a relatively minor tax on stamped paper that would be used in all legal proceedings. Right. And the Americans found this to be offensive because it was a violation of their historic right of Englishmen, which was to not be taxed without representation. So in 1765, most American revolutionaries or patriots, they actually began with the older English conception of rights. That is to say that they are the inheritors of the so-called rights of Englishmen. And the rights of Englishmen are the rights of a particular people at a particular place at a particular time. They are rights that have grown and evolved over the course of many, many centuries, right? Dating back to even before Magna Carta, right? So the Americans are the proud inheritors of that conception of rights. But they realize in 1765 that understanding of rights is insufficient to help them combat British legislation. So they start looking for a new understanding of rights that is less in history, as it were, that right. is, in fact, one might even say outside of or transcends history. That is to say, it's a view of rights that is grounded in nature, and nature is absolute, certain, permanent, universal. And that, I think, that's the critical moment in the revolutionary mind.
That's interesting because there's really what it's tying into is what's called sometimes derisively, though I think it shouldn't be derisive, the Whig interpretation of history, which is that the idea that there's ancient Anglo-Saxon approach to government that is then worked forward through English history that leads up to the great triumph of the Glorious Revolution of 1689, and that's the basis, the foundation for English rights. And it strikes me that in America there was a somewhat different situation, and that being basically Locke's man in the state of nature, actually being in the real life, real world version of that, they don't have to ground everything on this history going back 1,000 years. They can ground it on, well, here we are, we're the men in the state of nature. We can ground it on those Lockean arguments.
That's exactly right. And through the 1760s and then into the 1770s, certainly by 1775, these American colonists actually did literally view themselves to be in a Lockean state of nature. And they said so. They explicitly said that because Britain has, and more particularly George III, has withdrawn its protection of the British colonials in America, that they are without government. And in effect, the Massachusetts Government Act of 1774 so radically changed the nature of the government in Massachusetts that in effect, it abolished government and it created a military government. And so the Americans, yeah, they said, we are now in a state of nature. We must now begin to build new governments de novo.
Now, you talk about this being grounded in reason and nature, and this very Enlightenment era attitude of we can rationally arrive at certain conclusions by looking at nature. Now, the interesting thing is that Adam's quote about the real revolution being 15 years earlier talked about it being a revolution in our sense of religious duties, I think, as he puts it. So it was a religious revolution in a way. And that leads to something, how do you have this sort of very secular Enlightenment approach and it also being a religious approach? And that really raises the question, I think, that is not really very much unappreciated today, which is the grounding of this in an Enlightenment version of what was called natural religion.
Yeah. So now you've asked a really hard question, and a question that is undoubtedly worth another book, because I will tell you that some of my, for lack of a better term, Catholic tradcon critics of the book have claimed that my revolution is all Enlightenment, no religion, which is not true. Obviously, in the 1760s and 1770s, and really throughout the entire 18th and 19th centuries, the vast majority, 95, 98% plus of all Americans were religious. They were Christians. That's simply a fact. No one doubts that. But the more, I think, important and interesting story is how Christianity evolved throughout the course of the 18th century, right? So the American Christians, say of the 1760s, were not your John Winthrop Puritans of 1630, right? They in fact rejected almost entirely the political thought of the 17th century Puritans. So the really important story here, I think, is that beginning sometime in the early 18th century, say in the 1720s, and certainly picking up speed in the 1730s, you get European, more particularly English Enlightenment ideas coming to the 13 colonies and being adopted by America's best colleges, Harvard, Yale, Brown, Princeton. We're drinking deeply from the well of 17th and 18th century Enlightenment thought. So they were reading Bacon, Bacon's Novum Organum. They were reading Newton's Principia Mathematica. They were reading John Locke's Essay Concerning Human Understanding. And what happened was that the Americans really started rethinking what the nature of nature is. And what the laws of nature are. And all American revolutionaries, Christian or not, accepted the idea that there are certain scientific or physical laws of nature, and they accepted them as true, right? And that very fact in and of itself, of course, begins to undermine the traditional Puritan or Calvinist understanding of nature, with an omniscient, omnipotent God who can smash the laws of nature whenever he feels like it. But more importantly, the Americans began to think seriously that not only are there scientific laws of nature, but there are moral laws of nature. And so what they did was they then took the scientific method of Bacon and Newton, and then they started applying it to human things, right? And they started looking out at nature. So you can see this, for instance, in the early diaries of John Adams when he was a student at Harvard University. And Adams was, he's writing in his diary about reading Newton's Principia, reading Locke's essay, and then attempting himself to look out into the world, right, and observe human nature inductively, and examine human passions, examine human actions, and then from this broad-based observation, then to try and induce certain moral rules of human action. And now Adams was a Christian, and he was a Christian throughout his entire life. But here's the point, Rob, is that the Enlightenment had a profound impact on American Christianity, right? So sure, my conservative Christian critics can say, don't forget that American revolutionaries were Christians. Of course they were. But the real question is, what was their Christianity relative to what it had been 100 years before, right? And it had clearly changed under the influence of the Enlightenment.
Yeah, I think it's a curious thing I think that what happened is that it's a sort of a historical dead end in a way, that Enlightenment view of natural religion, the natural part of natural religion was the idea that, like for example, they would talk about natural versus revealed religion. So revealed religion is religious principles taken from the Bible, taken from Revelation, and natural religion was religious principles taken from secular observation of nature. And it was this almost like halfway house, or this halfway house between religious belief and a totally secular worldview, or some sort of integration between the two. And it's almost like that was sort of a philosophical, historical dead end, that by the middle of the 19th century, people who were secular had gone completely secular, and and mostly to the left, and people who were religious had gone sort of back to a more old-fashioned revelation-based approach to religion.
Yeah, no, I think that is exactly right. So in the end, I think what happened at the highest level of both philosophical and theological reflection was that, the most enlightened 18th century American Christians, who were now drinking deeply from the well of modern science, Bacon and Newton. But in the end, they came to realize that if on the one hand, your faith tells you that there can be talking snakes, burning bushes that talk and do not consume themselves, virgins giving birth, men walking on water, and the dead rising, how can that be understood in the light of the scientific laws of nature? And obviously it can't be, right? So there was this tension that had been built into this attempted reconciliation of reason and revelation. And I think you're absolutely right. What happens by the middle of the 19th century is that they either go completely secular, or they attempt to restore an older kind of faith-based religion without the Enlightenment.
Now, I want to go back a little bit to this issue of taking apart the Declaration of Independence, talking about the different ideas in it. And I really was fascinated by your analysis of equality. And I think it's the most misunderstood or most misused part of the Declaration of Independence today, particularly in the sort of welfare state context. So I want you to talk a little bit about what is it exactly that equality meant to the founders?
Right. So maybe the easiest way to get into this is to explain what it doesn't mean, because obviously the concept of equality has been completely corrupted over the course of the last 225 years. So equality did not mean that you should be equal in all respects. Equality does not mean sameness. Equality does not mean that all men should have the same stuff. The founders understood equality in a very precise sense. Equality was actually, it was less a moral prescription than it simply was a description of human nature. And it's what I call, they adopted, actually this idea comes originally from Locke. They held what I call a view of species equality. So all human beings are members of the same species, and that species should be contrasted with all other species. So in other words, all men are the same in that they are not dogs or horses. So then the question is, in what way are all men the same? What do they share in common? And the most important attributes that they share in common are 1, reason, and 2, free will. And this is what distinguishes all humans from all other animate beings. Now, this is where it gets both interesting and a little more complicated. So they had what I call an understanding of qualitative equality, in the sense that I just laid it out, that all human beings share the same fundamental qualities, reason and free will. However, they also recognize that there are quantitative differences, right? Not all individuals share the same intelligence. There are radical differences in terms of not just intelligence, but strength, speed, beauty, all kinds of measurable concepts. So in what sense then are they equal, and how should that equality be understood in a social political sense? Well, the bottom line is, for the founders, that equality means one thing and one thing only. It means that all individuals are equal in their right to be self-owning and self-governing, right? So what that means is no man is by nature the ruler of another, and no man is by nature the slave of another. All individuals are self-governing. And what that means when you unpack it is that all individuals have equal rights. So equality is really an adjective. They have equal rights. The fundamental point is that they have rights.
Well, yeah, describing it as an adjective, you also, I was very gratified to see that you referred to George Mason's, I think it's Declaration of the Rights in Virginia, where he actually turns it into an adverb. He says all men are equally free and independent. And it's the free and independent part that's the focus, and the equal is just a description of that.
Exactly. That's precisely right. Yeah. So now, so today, Rob, actually is the 60th interview that I've done in the last year on the book. And I can tell you that 99% of all the interviews have focused almost entirely on equality and slavery.
I was going to ask about slavery. I was going to ask about slavery because I thought you had a really interesting approach to that. So go ahead.
Right. So the obvious question is, and to be perfectly honest, I did not intend when I originally set out to write the book to have a chapter on slavery. I was just going to have a chapter on equality and then a chapter or 2 chapters on rights and consent and revolution. But after I wrote the equality chapter, it just was weighing on me. And I knew that every reviewer would say, how can Thompson write a book on the Declaration and have a whole chapter on equality and not take up the issue of slavery? So I wrote this chapter, and it turns out, it was, I think, just about almost the last chapter I wrote. And I wrote it very quickly in a couple of weeks. And it's a chapter that attempts to address an entirely legitimate question, an important question, which is, how could the American founding fathers declare equality and rights as self-evident truths and yet own slaves, right? How do you square that circle? That's the question. And the answer to the question is very complicated. I mean, the first thing to say is that, you know, despite what the people of the 1619 Project want to argue, it's not true that all American revolutionaries were slaveholders. It's not true that America was founded on the basis of slavery. What is true is that in 1776, there was a fairly broad spectrum of views on slavery. So at one end of the spectrum, you get people like John Adams, for instance, who never owned a slave and was a lifelong opponent of the institution of slavery. And then you get people like Benjamin Franklin and John Jay, who at one point had owned a house slave, what were called house slaves. That is, people, you know, who weren't out working in the fields, but who were essentially served as servants in the house, though they were, it is absolutely true, they were slaves. But then Franklin and Jay freed their slaves and then went on to become leading advocates of the anti-slavery movement. Then you get people like George Washington, for instance, who obviously was a slave owner, but who, upon his death in his will, freed his slaves after the death of his wife, Martha. And there were many slaveholders who did free their slaves, either at the time or upon their death. And then finally, then you get to the hard case, right? And the hard case comes in the form of Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry, right? Who were the two most, well, Jefferson was the author of the Declaration, and Patrick Henry was the author or the spokesman of probably the most famous slogan of the revolution, which was "Give me liberty or give me death." Right. So how can these two men own slaves? Well, it's very complicated. The first thing to say is that Jefferson and Patrick Henry, they knew that slavery was wrong. They knew it was immoral, and they said so. They condemned it in writing as immoral and as anathema to the revolution. And they did so, they knew, because it violated rights. Jefferson said slavery is wrong because it's a violation of rights. So why didn't they free their slaves? That's the big question. Well, there are several reasons. The first is they thought that slavery would die a natural death. Right? They assumed that slavery was on the way out and that it was going to die this natural death. But the real issue was this. It's what I call the post-emancipation problem. Right? And so it's easy for us in the 21st century to look back on the 18th century and condemn American founders, those who held slaves. But the real issue is, yeah, okay, sure, yes, we want to free our slaves, but the question is, how do you do it? How do you do it in a way that, here's the bottom line. How do you do it in a way that doesn't cause a race war? That was the principal worry of those revolutionaries. I mean, who were both slaveholders and non-slaveholders. They understood that there probably would be a race war, or potentially they feared a race war. And Jefferson was quite clear that at that point, then whites would, even though they are in the wrong, the law of self-preservation says they have a right to defend themselves. And more particularly, the question was, all right, if we free our slaves, then what? Free them to what? Where? When? How? Right? And they just couldn't think their way through the problem. I think there are ways to think through the problem, but in the context of their time, they couldn't. And the final thing to say is that it is important, I think, as I try to do in the book, to also recognize that the moral evil of slavery, and I think we should condemn those founding fathers who were slave owners for having committed this heinous moral crime, which I think, Rob, I think it can be summed up in this way. And this is a very bitter pill for us to have to swallow. And I can put it to you in this way. One of Thomas, this is a hypothetical, one of Thomas Jefferson's slaves escapes from Monticello and spends 3 days fleeing through forests and swamps. And after 3 days, Thomas Jefferson catches up to him on horseback. And it's just the two of them alone together in a forest. The question is this: does the slave, the runaway slave, have the moral right to kill Thomas Jefferson?
Well, yeah, absolutely he would. Yeah.
Of course he would. Of course he would, right? So the final point there was that I have, in the book, attempted to explain the profound complexity of dealing with the slavery issue at that time. But that still doesn't mean, however, that we don't, in the 21st century, have a historical, scholarly, moral obligation to condemn it for what it was. Now, let me just say one last thing, and that is, and I can talk about this more if you'd like, if you want to follow up, but it's also important to make clear that the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution is the single greatest force in human history for abolition, for freeing the slaves.
That's what I was going to follow up on, which is the thing that I got, the most interesting thing I got out of your chapter on slavery, is the fact that the revolution, created this conflict of natural equality versus slavery, and in a way, this talking about this moral revolution that happened, for 15 years before 1776. It was sort of accompanied by almost a kind of anti-slavery awakening, that there were not, prior to 1760, there were not anti-slavery laws or anti-slavery organizations in America. And after that, there are.
Absolutely. The revolution, as I said, is the single most important catalyst for starting an anti-slavery movement in America, and then ultimately an abolitionist movement. Now, what's the history of this? So you get, at the time of the revolution, just before 1776, you get the creation of the first ever anti-slavery societies in the United States. And then post-Declaration of Independence, every single state in the North passed laws, what were called gradual abolition laws, so that by 1803, every state in the North had abolished slavery. And then at the federal level, the articles, the government under the Articles of Confederation passed the Northwest Ordinance, which forbade the extension of slavery into the Northwest Territories. And then built into the Constitution was the slave trade clause, which abolished the international slave trade to America beginning in the year 1808. So they deferred, yes, not good, but the more important point is that they attempted to abolish the slave trade. And the other fact of the matter is, even in Virginia, between, I believe, 1780 and 1790, 10,000 slaves were freed, and 100,000 slaves were freed in all of America just after 1800. So there's no question the Revolution and the Declaration of Independence were the catalyst for the anti-slavery abolition movement.
I also think that people underestimate the effect of the ban on the slave trade, because of what it did is it severed the last of the economic incentives that the North had. less of the economic connections they had to slavery, in the sense that, northern traders and merchants could no longer profit from the slave trade. And, it's such a stark pattern that the southern states don't undergo this moral awakening and the northern states do. And it clearly has a lot to do with the economic incentives. And in severing those economic incentives for the North, you sort of make the turn again, and banning it in the West, you make the outnumbering of the South on slavery inevitable eventually.
Right. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Of course, the big problem, which was the kink in the works on all of this, was the invention of the cotton gin.
Yeah.
In the 1790s, right? And that gave a rebirth to the institution, an economic rebirth to the institution of slavery, because it allowed slavery to, certainly cotton production via the institution of slavery to become economically viable, which then allowed it to extend right beyond the original 13 states into into the what would become the new states of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana.
Mm-hmm. Now let's go from, so this has sort of the left's critique of the founding era and founding ideas as, oh, well, they were hypocrites, they didn't really mean it. Although usually that's used to mean, therefore we should all, the fact that they didn't live up to their ideals means we should throw out their ideals. But the sort of right of center critique is this idea of, well, the founding was actually very religious and you're making it to Enlightenment era. And one thing that really jumped out at this is, a couple of years ago, there were a bunch of books about the Enlightenment that came out. And I found an interesting pattern that, so you had Jonah Goldberg did a thing about the Enlightenment, and he's a sort of traditional 20th century conservatives. And he sort of made the Enlightenment seem like it's totally compatible with 20th century conservatism. And then Steven Pinker has a book on the Enlightenment and makes it seem like the Enlightenment ideals are totally compatible with sort of standard left of center 20th century sort of Clinton liberalism. And at the time I wrote something, it was based on a book done by Pat Mullins on Jonathan Mayhew, one of the people you talk about, who's one of these, natural religion, Enlightenment era clergymen, who very influential on John Adams in New England. And I said I felt kind of sheepish because it's almost like I'm writing this and making out the founding fathers to sound like objectivists, to sound like they're all sort of proto Ayn Rand people talking about reason and self-interest and individual rights and all that sort of thing. And so I sort of want to say for the audience of people, you've emboldened me to not feel so sheepish about that, because this basically takes that and shows that it's not just Mayhew, it's all of them had a lot of these ideas that are kind of, in an Enlightenment strain that is somewhat similar to what would in today's context be objectivist ideas. So I wanted to sort of say for those who know Ayn Rand, let's talk about the similarity between the Enlightenment ideas of the founding era and the Ayn Rand's philosophy versus what are the differences.
Right. So let me just first say that in contrast to some of my critics and presumably your critics as well, and that is, I actually believe, unlike them, in evidence-based history. Right. I think evidence is actually important. And what my book does, it's a relatively long book, about 420 pages, with hundreds and hundreds of footnotes. And so this is not an exercise in wish fulfillment for me, in demonstrating that the American founding was an Enlightenment founding, despite the fact that all Americans at that time were Christians and took their Christianity quite seriously. The two things are not necessarily, at least historically, incompatible. The fact is that they did exist. But what happened was, of course, as you noted earlier, ideas have consequences and they work themselves out over time to sort of their logical endpoints. And then what had been an attempted synthesis of Christianity and the Enlightenment began to tear apart. But the question that you asked, though, is about the ideas proposed by the founding fathers and their relationship to Ayn Rand. Well, I think Ayn Rand was the first person to say that certainly the ideas of her political philosophy were first expressed, not in the way that she did fully, but they were first expressed in some form by America's founding fathers, and including the intellectual godfather of the American Revolution, John Locke. So on that level, I think there are quite clear similarities. I mean, in other words, I don't think that the difference between the founding fathers and Ayn Rand on certainly political matters is a difference of kind. It's only a difference of degree, and barely a difference of degree. And
or to put it differently, Ayn Rand was an Enlightenment philosopher, right? A philosopher in the tradition of the Enlightenment.
One could say, even going further, that she is the epitome, that she is, in a sense, the to put it in Hegelian terms, the endpoint of Enlightenment history. And now, look, their view of the nature of reality, that is to say, metaphysics, their metaphysical views, their view of reason and its role in human affairs, I don't think it's appropriate or fair, really, to compare their views of metaphysics and epistemology to Ayn Rand's, right? I think it's more important to compare their views of metaphysics and epistemology to all those who came before them. So relative to Ayn Rand, their views, they had what we might call proto-objectivist views. Right. On reason and on nature of nature. It comes with their ethics. And so I think you can, and as I've tried to show in the book, I think more than any other book ever written on the American Revolution, I do demonstrate the very high degree to which they developed an ethical theory of individualism and of individual rights, and of the pursuit of happiness, right? So there's lots in their views that I think historically and chronologically speaking, all point towards Ayn Rand's conception of enlightened self-interest, right? And I mean, they were, to a certain degree, or at least some of them were, proponents of what I call enlightened self-interest, or self-interest rightly understood. But did they go the full way? Did they go as far as Ayn Rand? No, they did not. And here's where you see, I think, the real tension in their thought. Morally speaking, they had a strong dose of what we would call altruism, and this comes from their Christianity, which says that, that we have moral obligations to serve the needs of other people, and that which means the obverse of that is that others have needs that must be met and satisfied by the rest of us. And I think that tension in their thought, because they didn't fully themselves, and I'm not blaming them for not working out that tension, but the fact is the tension existed, or really a contradiction in their moral thought existed. And going into the 19th century, that moral contradiction was exploited. And the individualism of their ethical theory was abandoned for altruism and moral collectivism.
Yeah, it's actually interesting that the term altruism, they couldn't have been altruists in that sense, in the direct sense, because the term hadn't been coined yet. It was like an very extreme version of anti-individualism that was invented in the roughly 1830s, 1840s, somewhere in there, by Auguste Comte. So it's like taking that element of proto-altruism in the founders, and that, as you said, the ideas have consequences. They tend to develop to their most extreme versions. And that's something that developed to its most extreme version. That brings us to the question, actually, of the last chapter of this one of the last chapters of this book is, has America lost its American mind? I think in today's context, we just say, has America lost its mind? But I want you to talk just a little bit about how that happened, how it is that the ideas that were considered almost universally accepted among the founders came to not be as universally accepted.
Right. So first, a shout out to my wife, who came up with that wonderful title for the epilogue, Has America Lost Its American Mind? The title that I originally had for it was much more boring and academic-like. I think her title was brilliant. So this is the epilogue to the book, and what the epilogue does is it looks at the critics of the Declaration of Independence, the 19th and 20th century critics, and it begins with a fairly substantial discussion of the 19th century pro-slavery critique of the Declaration of Independence. So all of America's founding fathers, including slave owners like Jefferson and Patrick Henry, they all believed that slavery was, quote, a necessary evil, with the emphasis on the word evil. By the late 1830s, and certainly into the 40s and 50s, Southern slaveholders had had a dramatic change of mind on the question of slavery. Slavery was now going to be defended as what they called a positive good. And beginning in the late 1830s, they started to develop a new philosophy, which would justify what they called the peculiar institution. And this new philosophy had its roots in German Romanticism, beginning most importantly with the 19th century German philosopher Hegel. And Hegel's ideas, as well as the ideas of other German philosophers and thinkers at the time, were brought to America. In 1830, an American Southerner attended Hegel's lectures on the history of philosophy at the University of Berlin, brought those ideas back to America, and they used those ideas to create principles of the Declaration of Independence. So first, they critiqued the idea of truth with a capital T, the idea that truth can be absolute, certain, permanent, and universal. And they replaced it with this idea of historicism, which says that truth is historically contingent on particular places and particular times. And so what might have been true in 1776 is no longer true in 1839. And what is true in 1839, they believed, is that the slave South was, in Hegelian terms, the end point of history. So they saw history as pointing ultimately toward slavery. And so they literally went through the Declaration's four truths after abandoning the concept of capital T truth, and they rejected categorically the self-evident truth of equality. They now defended the idea of inequality, and they rejected the idea of rights, of rights that are absolute, permanent, and universal, for historic rights that evolve over time. They rejected the idea of consent and obviously the idea of revolution. But here's the really interesting thing, Rob. By the 1850s, Southern intellectuals had become so radicalized in German philosophy that some of their leading exponents, like the person who I think was their most theoretically sophisticated thinker, George Fitzhugh. By the 1850s, George Fitzhugh leveled what we might call a pre-Marxian critique of capitalism. And so these Southern intellectuals became the harshest critics imaginable of capitalism, using all of the arguments that Marx would use in Capital. And then on top of that, George Fitzhugh and others began to defend the institution of slavery and the Southern plantation as, quote unquote, and I'm literally quoting from Fitzhugh, the beau ideal of communism. So this is now the great justification of the institution of slavery, is that it is the ultimate expression of socialism, right? And then the second half of the epilogue takes up the arguments of late 19th and early 20th century progressives, like most importantly, John Dewey, Herbert Croly, Woodrow Wilson. And what was really interesting is that they level the same kinds of critiques against the Declaration of Independence that these pro-slavery Southerners had used in the 1840s and 1850s.
That's interesting because it kind of brings us up in a way to the present, because we're seeing almost a similar kind of thing happening now. And here's why I want to spend a few minutes actually giving you an opportunity to promote your Substack blog. And it's called Redneck Intellectual. And I want to note, does Canada produce rednecks?
Of course they do. It's a different kind of redneck, to be sure. But yeah, there are Canadian rednecks, and then there are also Canadian rednecks who move to the deep south and fit right in. And I don't mean that in any pejorative sense. I live now in South Carolina, and I feel pretty much at home here as a transported Canadian, because at least, Southerners, like Canadians, have a certain appreciation for politeness.
Yes. So as a transplanted Canadian / South Carolinian redneck, your blog is called The Redneck Intellectual, and you've been taking on there the sort of nationalist conservatives who are doing the same sort of transition from the the conservatism of the last 40, 50 years has been very focused around the founding fathers and the founding tradition. And they're going through this process almost all over again of rejecting that in favor of inequality and in favor of nationalism and collectivism and an anti-capitalist ideology. And you've been taking that on your blog.
I have been. And it all began last May when I published an essay titled "The Rise and Fall of the Pajama Boy Nietzscheans." And that essay went viral, and I was the subject of great Twitter abuse for several months. And then I think to date, there have been, certainly over 20, maybe 22, 25 essays that have been published in response to the Pajama Boy Nietzscheans essay. And then on top of it, I created my Substack, The Redneck Intellectual, and started writing a series of essays in response to my critics. And those that I call the Pajama Boy Nietzscheans are what I also call the reactionary right, which is a kind of new, certainly political, if not intellectual, movement on the right. And I break the reactionary right down into two subgroups. On the one hand, there are what I call the Catholic tradcons, or tradcaths, as they're sometimes called. And then on the other hand, the much more curious group, that is the followers, the online right followers of the pseudonymously named Bronze Age Pervert. And so my argument is that both of these groups, who, by the way, hate each other, they share one thing in common with each other and with the left and the 1619 Project, which is a rejection of the principles and institutions of the American founding. And they all want, in a sense, a new founding which rejects 1776 and which imports new ideas, which creates a new American regime based either on the ideas of Catholic integralism, which is to say, they basically want a Catholic monarchy in the United States. And then on the other hand, the followers of the Bronze Age pervert, the perv himself has called for a military state. And he's developed this kind of infantile Nietzschean philosophy that seeks to liberate what he calls the vitalism of individuals against, and I certainly appreciate, against nihilism and egalitarianism, but what he is calling for in place of the principles of the founding is something that one might say flirts with fascism. And he's you know, his political heroes are Franco and Edward Stroessner and Mussolini, right? And
I think that's maybe a little more than
for a new Caesar.
Yeah, it's a little more than flirting with fascism, but that's the Bronze Age part. I mean, you know, it's a good thing the camera's been on you for most of this time, because I have a hard time keeping a straight face even talking about a guy who calls himself Bronze Age pervert. But it's the Bronze Age part that fascinates me, because conservatives have for so long been steeped in this this thing about how we're the defenders of Western civilization. We're the defenders not just of America, but of Western civilization. And here's the guy saying, no, let's throw out all of Western civilization, everything since the Greeks. Let's throw that all out and go back to the Bronze Age. I mean, it's a primitivist kind of philosophy. And it's hard to take Bronze Age pervert seriously, but this has a certain cachet. I'm seeing the impact it's having on much more mainstream conservatism. So I think the big question is, what went wrong with conservatism that it was so vulnerable to this?
Yeah, that's a great and a very important question. So you have to understand, yeah, how and why these two factions of the reactionary right arose. And I think it arose because there was a kind of intellectual and political vacuum on the right. That was a kind of self-induced intellectual seppuku of the establishment right. That is to say, conservatism and libertarianism, Inc. Had really, I mean, they had become feckless, intellectually and politically feckless, unable to stand up to, successfully unable to stand up to the totalitarian left. And so these two movements really, I think, are in part, if not large part, born of the failure of the establishment right to fight the left. Mm-hmm. Right. So I do think that, and I think they're right about that. I think the establishment right has failed to fight
I would
the left.
say it's not just a failure of the establishment right to fight the left, but also the failure of the establishment right to fully appreciate and absorb and start from the ideas that they were given by the founding fathers. And that's why I think your book is so important.
Yeah, without question. I mean, by 2010, if not earlier, they were just repeating stale, they were just treating the principles of the Declaration of Independence as stale slogans. That's all it was, right? They had no understanding of those principles at all. Yeah. And so, my book was really an attempt to resurrect on a deep philosophic basis the principles and institutions of the American founding. So in other words, you might say my goal in writing the book was to make the American founding great again.
Well, I think you've done a great job. I've really enjoying reading this, getting a lot out of it. And I think that is the big project to sort of save, I won't say the American right, but save a pro-freedom movement in America is to, a great place to start is to go back to really fully, deeply understanding the founding fathers. So thanks so much for coming on today to talk about that.
Rob, thank you so much. Have a great day.
If you enjoyed this interview, you can find more ideas and analysis at the Tracinski Letter, www.tracinskiletter.com. You can also support us at Patreon at patreon.com/Salon of the Refused. And you should also follow our podcast and our YouTube channel. I'm Rob Tracinski. Thank you for listening.